I spent 6 summers working as a counselor at a youth camp tucked deep inside the northern forests. It wasn't the kind of place you'd accidentally stumble across. The nearest town was nearly 40 miles away, and once the camp buses left, the only sounds at night were wind through the pines and the occasional call of an owl. For 6 years, nothing truly unusual ever happened. Kids got homesick. Someone always twisted an ankle during hiking. Cabins played harmless pranks on each other. Everything was exactly what you'd expect from a summer camp. Until the third session of July 2021. To this day, I don't know how to explain what happened, and I don't expect anyone listening to believe me. But I remember every detail. Because whatever was in Cabin 7, it wasn't one of my campers. Camp life settled into its usual rhythm faster than it always seemed to. Breakfast at 7, hiking trails before noon, swimming after lunch, and campfire stories once the sun disappeared behind the trees. By the third day, the campers knew each other well enough that the cabins were constantly filled with laughter, card games, and harmless arguments over whose turn it was to clean. Cabin 7 was no different. I had 12 boys between the ages of 13 and 15. Every evening before lights out, camp policy required counselors to perform a headcount. It wasn't optional. We counted every camper before bed, again before breakfast, and once more before leaving for any activity. After 6 summers, I could practically do it with my eyes closed. That Wednesday night, I stood in the doorway with my clipboard and counted. 1, 2, 3. I worked my way around the room until I reached the last bunk. 1, 11, 12. Everything looked normal. Still, there was something stirring in the shadows. Around 2:30 that morning, I woke up to the sound of someone whispering. At first, I assumed one of the boys was talking in his sleep. It happened every session. I rolled over, checked the time on my phone, and tried to ignore it. Then I heard another voice answer. My eyes opened immediately. It wasn't loud enough to understand the words, but there were definitely 2 people having a quiet conversation somewhere inside the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the hallway. The entire cabin was silent. The whispers had stopped. Thinking one of the campers had gotten out of bed, I decided to do another head count before sending them back to sleep. I started with the first bunk. 1, 2, 3. The beam of my flashlight moved slowly from bed to bed. 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Then my light reached the far corner of the cabin. For just a second, I counted 13. I lowered the flashlight. The next morning, I convinced myself I had simply been exhausted. Lack of sleep can make your mind play tricks on you, especially when you're responsible for a dozen teenagers in the middle of nowhere. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about those whispers. After breakfast, while the campers were getting ready for the day's activities, I walked around Cabin 7 to clear my head. That's when I noticed something unusual. The ground outside had been soaked by rain the evening before. Every footprint from the campers was easy to recognize because they all led toward the dining hall. But just beneath the window closest to the last bunk, there was another set. Large boot prints, much larger than anything the campers wore. They came out of the woods, stopped directly beneath the window, and then disappeared. There were no return tracks, no second trail, just a single line of footprints ending at the cabin wall. The mud was still soft. The impressions were fresh. Whoever made them had been standing there only a few hours earlier. I called another counselor over and pointed toward the tracks. He stared for a few seconds before shrugging. Probably one of the maintenance guys, he said. Maybe he was right, but something didn't sit right with me. The maintenance crew never came into the woods before sunrise, and they definitely didn't wear boots that size. I didn't tell the campers. I didn't tell the camp director. Instead, I took one last look toward the tree line. For just a moment, I had the overwhelming feeling that someone was standing between the pines, watching the cabin. When I looked again, there was nothing there. That night, I decided I wasn't going to sleep. If someone had been outside the cabin, I wanted to know who it was. After lights out, I stayed awake in the common room, with nothing but a flashlight, a radio, and a cup of burnt camp coffee. For nearly 2 hours, nothing happened. The cabin was completely silent. Just after 1:30 in the morning, I heard it, a slow, deliberate footstep. Not outside, inside. The sound came from the hallway, leading to the campers' rooms. It wasn't loud, just enough to make the old wooden floor complain beneath someone's weight. I switched off my flashlight. If someone was inside the cabin, I didn't want them to know I was awake. Another step, then another. Whoever it was wasn't trying to sneak. They were walking at a steady pace, almost as if they already belonged there. I slowly stood and moved toward the hallway. My heartbeat was so loud I could hear it in my ears. The hallway was empty. Every bedroom door was closed. I waited. 10 seconds. 20. 30. Nothing. I was about to turn back when one of the bedroom doors slowly drifted open by itself. Not slammed, not pushed, just eased open. I swept my flashlight into the room. Every camper was asleep, exactly where they were supposed to be. Then one boy suddenly sat straight up in bed. His eyes were fixed on the doorway. Not at me, past me. In a trembling voice, he whispered, "Who's standing behind you?" Every muscle in my body locked. I couldn't bring myself to turn around. I stood completely still. My body refused to move. The boy never looked away from whatever he was staring at. His eyes stayed fixed, just over my shoulder. Then another camper woke up. He looked toward the hallway and immediately pulled his blanket over his face. I finally found the courage to turn around. At the end of the hallway, someone was standing there. At first, I thought it had to be another counselor, but the longer I looked, the less that made sense. The figure was unusually tall. Its head nearly reached the top of the door frame. It wasn't moving. It wasn't speaking. It simply stood there, watching us. I raised my flashlight. The beam landed directly on the figure. For a fraction of a second, I expected to see a face. Instead, the hallway was empty. No footsteps. No door closing. Nothing. The figure had vanished. I searched every room in the cabin. Every window was locked. Every exit was still secured from the inside. There was nowhere anyone could have gone in those few seconds. I radioed the camp director immediately. Within minutes, several counselors arrived with flashlights and searched the surrounding woods. They found no one, no footprints, no broken branches, nothing that suggested another person had ever been there. As everyone returned to the cabins, one of the senior counselors quietly asked me something that still bothers me today. He said, "Why were all 12 campers awake at exactly the same moment?" I didn't have an answer, because they weren't all awake. According to every camper I spoke to the next morning, they all remembered seeing the figure, but each of them insisted they had been awake before anyone else. The sheriff's department arrived just after sunrise. They searched every cabin, every hiking trail, and every inch of the forest surrounding the camp. They found nothing. No footprints, no fingerprints, no signs that anyone had entered the property during the night. When they asked me to explain exactly what I'd seen, I struggled to find the words. How do you describe someone whose face you never actually saw? How do you explain a person who simply wasn't there anymore? The officers were polite, but I could tell they believed exhaustion had gotten the better of me. By the end of the investigation, they ruled it out as a misunderstanding. Officially, nothing had happened. The campers finished the rest of the week without another incident. One by one, Their parents picked them up, and the camp returned to its usual quiet. Before locking Cabin 7 for the season, I completed one final inspection. I checked every room, every window. Everything was exactly as it should have been. Then I looked down at the old attendance clipboard I'd been carrying all week. Tucked beneath the final headcount sheet was a page I had never seen before. It listed every camper assigned to Cabin 7. I counted the names once, then again. There were 13. I checked the camp records later that afternoon. Only 12 boys had ever been registered. No missing camper. No last-minute addition. No clerical mistake. I still have that copied roster in a folder at home. Every few years I take it out and count the names again. And every single time, there are still 13. I don't know who the extra camper was, and I'm not sure I ever want to find out. I've been leading wilderness hikes for almost 8 summers. By that point, I knew every trail around the camp by memory. I didn't need a map. I knew which paths flooded after rain, which ones led to the old fire tower, which ones the younger campers weren't allowed to use because the terrain became too steep. There wasn't a single trail on that mountain I hadn't walked dozens of times. Or at least, that's what I believed. The morning started like every other hiking day. Clear skies, cool air, 12 campers, 1 assistant counselor. A simple 3-mile loop that usually took us a little over 2 hours. Everything was completely normal until I saw a trail that shouldn't have existed. It wasn't marked. It wasn't blocked off. It simply wasn't there the day before. And if I had trusted my instincts, none of us would have stepped onto it. About an hour into the hike, we reached a fork in the trail. Except, it wasn't supposed to be there. I stopped walking so suddenly that the campers behind me almost bumped into each other. My assistant counselor looked at me and asked what was wrong. I pointed toward the narrow trail disappearing into the trees. "Has that always been there?" She looked for a moment before shrugging. "I don't know." That answer bothered me. She had worked at the camp for 4 summers. Even if she wasn't as familiar with the trails as I was, she should have remembered something like this. I stepped closer. The path looked old, not freshly cut. The ground was covered in pine needles, and moss had begun growing over parts of it. It looked like people had walked there years ago, not recently. I pulled the folded trail map from my backpack and spread it across a nearby tree stump. Every marked hiking trail was there. The lake, the fire tower, the old ranger station, even abandoned maintenance roads. But this trail didn't exist. One of the campers joked that maybe we discovered a secret path. The others laughed. I forced a smile, but something didn't feel right. My instincts told me to turn everyone around and continue on the marked trail. Instead, curiosity won. I told the campers we'd only walk a few hundred feet, just enough to see where it went. Looking back now, that was the biggest mistake I made all summer. The first few minutes felt completely normal. The trail was narrow, but easy enough to follow. The campers were still laughing and talking behind me, throwing pine cones at each other and complaining about how much farther we had to walk. Then, the forest went silent. Not gradually, instantly. The conversations behind me stopped, one after another. No birds, no wind, not even the sound of insects. It was as if someone had muted the entire forest. I looked over my shoulder. Every camper had noticed it too. One of the younger boys asked quietly, "Why did everything stop?" I didn't answer, because I didn't have one. I've spent most of my life hiking through forests. Nature is never completely silent. Even on the calmest days, you hear something. Leaves moving, birds calling, branches creaking. Out there was nothing. We kept walking another 100 yards. That's when I noticed something even stranger. One of the older campers pointed deeper into the woods. There, between the trees, was an empty campsite, a cold fire pit, 2 rusted folding chairs, a faded green tent, and hanging from a low branch, a bright red backpack. It looked as though someone had stepped away, only seconds before we arrived, but there wasn't a single person anywhere in sight. I told everyone to stay where they were. No one moved. The campsite looked abandoned, but not old. The fire pit still contained blackened wood, as if someone had burned a fire there only a day or 2 earlier. The folding chairs were facing each other. One of them had been knocked over. The other was standing perfectly upright. It looked less like someone had packed up and left, and more like they had walked away in the middle of a conversation. I slowly approached the red backpack hanging from the tree. It wasn't torn. It wasn't covered in dirt. It looked almost new. I reached for the zipper, then stopped. Something didn't feel right. The assistant counselor quietly asked if we should leave. Before I could answer, one of the campers pointed toward the tent. The zipper just moved. I looked immediately. The tent door was closed, completely still. I told myself he must have imagined it. Children notice things adults don't, but they also imagine things adults never would. Still, I couldn't ignore the feeling that someone was watching us, not from the trail, not from the tent, from somewhere deeper in the woods. Then, a whistle echoed through the trees. One long, slow, perfectly clear whistle. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't the wind. It sounded exactly like the whistle counselors used to call campers back to the cabins. Every camper instinctively turned toward the sound, except me, because I knew something they didn't. No counselor carried a whistle on hiking days, and whatever had just called to us wanted us to follow it. I didn't wait to hear the whistle again. I looked at my assistant counselor and quietly said, "We're leaving, right now." She nodded without asking any questions. The campers could tell from the expression on my face that this wasn't part of the hike anymore. Nobody complained, nobody joked. They simply fell into line behind us. I turned us around, expecting to retrace our own footprints back to the main trail. But after nearly 10 minutes of walking, nothing looked familiar. The massive fallen pine we'd passed earlier was gone. The strange campsite had disappeared. Even the trail itself looked different. It felt wider, older, as though we were walking somewhere entirely new. I stopped and unfolded the camp map again. According to the compass, we were heading west, exactly the direction that should have taken us back to camp. Instead, the forest only seemed to grow denser. That's when one of the boys at the back of the group called my name. His voice was shaky. "I think someone's following us." Every camper froze. I slowly turned around. There was no one on the trail, just rows of towering pine trees fading into the fog. I told myself he had imagined it. Then another camper whispered, "I heard footsteps." A second later, I heard them too. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Heavy footsteps. Not on the trail, just beyond it. Always matching our pace. Whenever we stopped, they stopped. Whenever we walked, they walked. Hidden somewhere behind the trees, close enough to hear, but never close enough to see. The footsteps followed us for what felt like forever. No matter how fast we walked, they stayed the same distance away, never getting closer, never falling behind. Then, without warning, the trail ended. Right in front of us stood an old wooden sign. It was gray with age, cracked down the middle, and almost completely covered in moss. I wiped away years of dirt with my sleeve. Painted across the wood were 3 words: Camp Pine Ridge. The name hit me immediately. That was our camp. But the arrow beneath it pointed deeper into the forest, not back toward where we'd come from. I stared at it in disbelief. Someone had either moved the sign, or we were standing somewhere that made absolutely no sense. One of the campers quietly asked, "Are we lost?" I wanted to tell him no. I wanted to sound confident. Instead, I admitted something I'd never said in all my years as a counselor. "I don't know where we are." The words had barely left my mouth when the whistle echoed again. This time, it came from behind us. Every camper spun around at once. The footsteps had stopped. The forest was silent. Then, through the fog, a figure appeared. Too far away to make out a face, standing perfectly still between two enormous pine trees, watching us. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. After several long seconds, the figure slowly raised one arm and pointed farther down the trail. None of us followed the figure. The moment it pointed deeper into the forest, I made the only decision that felt right. I grabbed the nearest camper by the shoulder and shouted, "Run!" No one questioned me. 12 terrified campers and 2 counselors sprinted through the trees without looking back. Branches whipped across our faces. Roots caught our feet. More than once, I thought I heard those heavy footsteps crashing through the woods behind us. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the forest changed. The silence disappeared. Birds were singing again. The wind returned. And just ahead, I saw the familiar wooden bridge that marked the edge of the camp property. We stumbled back into camp, exhausted and covered in dirt. The camp director came running toward us. He looked relieved, but also confused. Before I could explain what had happened, he looked at his watch and asked, "What took you so long?" "Hours." He frowned. Then he said something that made every hair on my arms stand up. "Hours? You've only been gone 12 minutes. I laughed. I actually laughed because I thought he was joking. He wasn't. Every counselor at camp, every kitchen worker, even the security camera at the front gate showed that only 12 minutes had passed since we'd entered the woods. But every one of us remembered hiking for what felt like half a day. When we checked our backpacks later that evening, something even stranger turned up. Every compass we had carried, mine, my assistant counselors, even the small emergency compass attached to a camper's backpack, had stopped at the exact same time. 10:43 a.m. None of them ever worked again. The trail has never appeared since. I've searched for it every summer. I've walked every marked path, compared satellite maps, even spoken with retired rangers who knew those woods be. Sometimes I wonder if we simply got lost. But then I remember 12 people sharing the exact same impossible memory. And every time I lead a hike now, when we reach that bend in the trail, I still catch myself looking into the trees, just to make sure that path isn't waiting for us again.